Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Songwriters on Process podcast. My name is Benno Papari, and since 2010, I've run the Songwriters on Process website, where you can find more than 200 conversations with songwriters about the creative process. I'm not here to talk about tour stories, band drama, how a band got its name, or favorite foods. My goal is to treat songwriters as writers, plain and simple. This is an intelligent conversation about the writing process between two writers. And today's interview is with Kevin Morby. I will apologize in advance for any audio issues on this. I'm doing this from a hotel room in Denver with no external mic, just the mic on my laptop. And there were a couple of drops in our interview, but nothing major. But Morby was doing this from, it looked like the laundry room or some room he was vacationing in the Lake of the Ozarks. And if I have the timing right, it was a couple of days before he threw out the first pitch at the Kansas City Royals baseball game. So maybe he was down there just prepping for it. I've got a great context-free quote from this interview with Morby, and he told me this: "I'm a 34-year-old adult man, and I've just started to floss for the first time in my life." Now, what the heck does that have to do with the songwriting process? Well, you got to listen to find out, but he's got a great answer for it. A couple of other things stood out. One is he said, "I'd like a Bic pen and a yellow notepad because you can be messy." He said there's no pressure. He does have a fancy pen and a fancy journal, but he finds when he does that, there's a lot of pressure to make things great. But he finds that if he goes low tech, and by low tech, I mean cheap Bic pen and yellow legal pad, it gives him permission to be messy with the process. And I love that about that ritual. That's very cool. He also tends to pace a lot when he writes. He said, "It's bliss to me. I need a quiet place to pace." And that really was interesting to me because about a month ago, I interviewed Aaron Ray, and Aaron Ray collaborates with Morby on his latest album, which is great, by the way. They have a song together. And Aaron Ray told me the same thing, that she likes to pace when she writes. And so Morby likes to pace on a hardwood floor with his guitar, which is exactly what Aaron Ray told me. And they're big friends, and they're good friends. And apparently he didn't know that about her. He's also a big runner, and I'm a big proponent of this. If you've ever listened to this podcast at all, you know how much I talk about running as it relates to the creative process. And just like me, this is spot on exactly what I do. He says he likes to use running as a way to work out the kinks, and it lets his guard down. And he just kind of lets everything out. It's a great way to work things out. And I do the same thing when I have a problem. When I'm in a rut, I go run. And he said that it's a way just to get the kinks out, or if you're struggling with anything, he loves to go for a run. And he's also said it's a great way to kind of find out what's good and what's bad when he writes, and for not just clarity of thinking for afterwards when he writes, but also during the process as well. So with that, here is my interview with Kevin Morby. Are you an everyday type of writer? You know, I find that some songwriters feel it's important to create in some fashion every day, whether or not they get inspired. Others say, no, just wait until the muse strikes. Where do you fall in that continuum?
You know, I'm sort of both, but I'd say I'm very much, if I had to lean one direction more than the other, it would be an everyday sort of writer. It's sort of like breathing almost at times. Yeah, I find, I like, full disclosure, I have ADD. So I think that drives my incessant output and desire to always need to be working on something. But I also do think that there's something to be said for the person who sort of waits for the muse to strike. And there's some of that too. I think that, like, being someone who writes all the time, I'm very self-aware of the fact that a lot of this stuff, may not end up being anything. But it's almost like as if I'm doing it constantly. So when the muse does strike, I'm ready to go. I'm like armed and ready to go.
Would you consider yourself a disciplined writer? In other words, like, do you set aside time at some point during the day? I mean, some people say, yes, this is my writing time. Or is it, at the end of the day, if you haven't written, is it like, shit, I should start writing something kind of thing?
No, I'm the type of person that if you put any sort of rules or guidelines around something, I won't want to do it.
Hmm.
So it really needs to just be on a sort of sporadic time clock, but with that said, it does kind of become an everyday or at least like weekly thing where I am setting aside time to work on these things. But yeah, it's not, I can't do a rigorous thing. I've always said that, like, I'm not the type of person who can sort of wake up and sit in a chair and with, a pen and a guitar next to me. It's gotta be sort of, there's got to be some sort of romantic notion to it of just, oh, I have this thought right now, or I just picked up a guitar and I stumbled into this thing.
Yeah. Do you do any type of writing outside of songwriting, journaling, anything like that, or just strictly songwriting?
Honestly, strictly songwriting. I do every once in a while. I will take a journal around with me, and I will jot down ideas. I really utilize the notes app in my phone. The phone, I think, like, it kind of sucks to talk about. I know, like, having to talk about an iPhone more than like they already, are in our conversation and take over our lives. But with that said, as a songwriting tool, it's been nothing but great for me in terms of just the voice memos and the notes. Because it's like, in the past, I would carry around, I used to have this Tascam DP008, and it was a battery powered little digital 8-track that I would carry around in my suitcase and stuff. And I could kind of jot ideas down, but with the phone, it does make it so I could be anywhere and I can just, sing something into my phone, and it's like having a little tape recorder. So, I do write down like a lot of ideas. A lot of them end up in my notes app. Every once in a while, I will have a sort of journal. For example, this is a photograph. The whole title of the record and the title of the title track, the song, this is a photograph, all came from me writing sort of a series of poems that began with, "This is a photograph."
Yeah. So, and I have to ask you about the Notes app, because that's pretty common. A lot of songwriters say, the Notes app. I'm fascinated by the organization behind these Notes app, because I mean, some songwriters tell me there's no organization whatsoever, and they just literally have to press play on every one to find the one they're looking for. It says there, but some of them will do it by emotion or title or topic. Is there any organization? Because you got to have hundreds of ideas on that phone, right?
Hundreds. If I wasn't doing this Zoom on my phone, I would pull up the app and tell you how many there were. But I mean, it's just hundreds and hundreds. And I have old phones that a lot of them are lost in the phones. And it's funny you ask this question now, because I honestly probably just in the past couple of months started to organize them somewhat, and still even barely any. But I am putting little titles next to them, an abbreviation. So if I'm working on something that's called, "The Sky is Blue Today," it'll be TSIB. I do that, and then I'll be looking back. I'm like, wait, what was this? And then I'll listen to it, like, oh yeah, that's where I had this idea. The sky was blue today, or whatever it was. So it's a funny thing, but there's usually no organization in those things at all. And you just have to sift through hundreds of them. And I often find that I'll be looking for something. I'll remember I had done something that I liked, and while sifting through them, I'll stumble upon something else. I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot that thing. And then I'll start concentrating on that thing. So I also, this is gross, but I'm a 34-year-old adult man, but I just started to floss really for the first time in my life. And I started to also categorize these notes. So I think I'm growing up a little bit.
Wait, so what does the flossing have to do with, I'm missing something. What does the flossing have to do with the process here?
I just think maybe a therapist would look at the fact that I'm like starting to organize my voice notes and that I'm starting to floss, and they would say, you're growing up a little bit.
Oh man, there's so much to unpack there. I'm not even sure where to start with that. Only because I've never heard anyone say, I'm starting to floss now. That's great. Listen, let's be honest. Most people that say that they floss don't floss, right?
It's true. It's true.
So do you, now when you go through those notes app, are you saying, oh, like, where's that idea? I know it's somewhere. Or are there times when you go, I'm just kind of in a rut. Let me go back and maybe something there will kind of, get me going started on a song.
It's kind of both. I find that a lot of times having access to the all these ideas that are sort of, captured in this vault on my phone. It's something that I'll visit when I'm on a long flight, or if I'm on a long walk or a run, and I sort of get burnt out of listening to other things, other people's music or whatever. I'll think, oh, I have all these ideas. And that's what I mean about it as a songwriting tool having only been really good for me, is that I quite literally like will write songs with this like as a tool. And I've said this a lot, but like my record, Oh My God, I literally wrote a lot of that album while on airplanes. I was traveling like crazy at the time. I was flying constantly on tour, and I felt that I just sort of be up there in the sky with my notes app and my voice memos, and I would kind of construct the songs, and it would get to a point where I'd be listening to a demo that's sort of half finished or a half idea, but I could come up with the other ideas. Oh, I'm going to get rid of that verse, and I'm going to like replace this there, and I'm going to put a bridge in that place. And so by the time the plane would land and I get to a hotel and could take out my guitar, I will have already sort of been working on the song in my head, knowing what I was going to do with it.
This actually reminds me of something interesting, because I find that as a writer, if you were to just say like, sit here and write for 2 hours, I'd get nothing done. But if you say to me, okay, we have to leave in 2 hours.
Exactly.
So I create false deadlines for myself. And a false deadline is something like, oh, I've got something to do. And if I've got a phone call, if I have to be somewhere with my wife at 5, maybe I won't start doing anything until 4. Because I know that and I learned that about myself, because we live in DC and I go to New York for work a lot, and I'll take that train and I'll get more work on that 3-hour train ride than if I sat here. So it sounds like that works well for you. Those kind of, whether you know it or not, those deadlines, because you probably said to yourself, I got to get this done by the time the plane lands, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's not, there's no hard deadline, but it's more just, it's almost, I definitely do agree with that. I think if you gave me 1,000 hours to do something, I would get the most done in like the last 60 minutes of those 1,000 hours. But, I think it's more just there's something about the having the access to it. I was thinking the other day about, it's kind of fascinating that I have all these lyrics. There's so many lyrics and I can just remember them, when I go to band rehearsal, I never have to print out lyrics or anything. They're just all kind of there. But I was thinking about the other day because, I've been working on some music recently, and I have all these songs, and I'm playing them into my phone and then listening back constantly. And it's a thing where, I get so inundated with the music and with the words. I listen to them, what probably turns out to be hundreds of not thousands of times over and over while I'm trying to figure the song out. So by the time it's done, I've seen it in so many different formations that I just know the thing inside and out. But like if I'm working on something, one day, and I come up with this melody and I come up with some lyrics and I'm working on it, and I work on it all day, and I capture 60 different like little snippets of it or whatever, and then the next day I wake up and I listen to it. A lot of times a very obvious change will be very clear. Something that I couldn't see the day before, shortly after capturing this idea, will start to become clear. And so I find that having access to these and giving them a little bit of space and revisiting them, and then listen to a few days in a row and then forgetting about it for a month and then revisiting a month down the road, it starts to just become clear. It starts to become sort of like this real thing to you. Whereas, once it was just this little idea. And so it's something that I've learned. It's been a good part of my writing process, is that, songs just sort of take time to expose themselves to the creator of what they ultimately want to be. And you kind of just have to give them time to help take shape. And I think sometimes you come up with a song, and in its first little iteration, it's got more growing to do. And that's because you got to go out and collect more to put into it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So do you deliberately use, when I go to revise my writing, distance is an important part. So do you deliberately do that and say,
For sure,
I'm going to set aside this and come back tomorrow? So it sounds like you make that a deliberate part of your process.
For sure. Yeah. Cause I think that there's definitely, you can sort of kill a song by beating over the head too much. And so there always gets to a point where you're like, okay, I got to step back. And, sometimes it's once you start to think it's a sort of bad song, or, this idea, maybe there's nothing here. I thought there was something here an hour ago. That's usually when it's time to step away. And then if you give it some space and revisit it, in a couple hours or a couple days or even a couple of weeks or months, you could be like, oh, wait, no, that actually feels really good. I could see that being something.
And I have songwriters tell me that they've given distance 5-10 years. Do you have songs
Sure.
like that you maybe discarded years ago and then somehow they come back to life?
All the time, all the time. Those are all over my records where, they'll be trying to think of a good example, but there's definitely an old idea or an old song that just sort of, rears its head. And you thought, oh, I thought this thing was never going to have a home, but it actually would make a lot of sense on this thing, which I really love the idea of that, because you can look at it as a coincidence, or you can look at it as sort of this cosmic thing that, oh, some part of me knew to write this 10 years ago. And, it just didn't have a shelter, a home until this moment where I'm writing this album, and thematically it weirdly fits. And it's almost like this brainchild of mine 10 years ago was the first seed to, what became part of this larger thing years down the road. But I really like that. I would always hear stories in the past of, this songwriter, that songwriter, Leonard Cohen, it took him 4 years to write Hallelujah. And you think, how could it take someone 4 years to write? And, you realize someone's not working on a song every single waking moment of every day for 4 years. It's just, they're living their life and touching on that song and then letting it sit and then coming back to it for the span of 4 years. And sometimes that's what it takes, to let a song be what it needs to be.
You mentioned the pen briefly. Do you ever do any lyric writing with a pen and paper, or are you strictly iPhone?
No, I definitely do pen and paper. I think that usually comes a little later in the process. It's 90% of the time when I'm writing songs, I'm writing the music first, and then I'm sort of speaking this weird gibberish on top of it, to help form a melody. And then I'll start to put words within that gibberish that are a similar shape. And once I start to sort of craft the groundwork or the good blueprint for what's going to be, what I believe are strong enough lyrics to create the song, that's usually when I move over to pen and paper. There's something about the sort of like classic act of writing it out and seeing it and having it in front of you. And then it can become a real thing where you're sitting down and you can, as you perform it or as you record it or whatever, you can be looking at this physical hard copy of the song, and it makes it all the more real. But whereas I think some people probably do that in the beginning, they write out lyrics onto a sheet of paper. It's usually one of the last steps for me, though. I said that's 90% of the time. There is this 10% of the time where I'll write out a poem or write some lyrics that I think is cool, and then put those to music, intentionally write music around those lyrics. That's way less common for me, but that does happen. A good example of that would be on my last album. There's a song called A Coat of Butterflies, which is a song about Jeff Buckley. That's something that it was all about the pen and paper and then putting that to music.
So wait, did you know that was going to be a song at first, or was that something that maybe started out as just a poem?
It started out basically as just a poem. To be honest with you, it started out as I was doing an interview with a writer named Josh Terry, who worked for Vice magazine at the time. And they were doing this, series where they would have a songwriter pick out a classic album that they had not heard. And then they'd play the record in front of that person and interview them about it in real time. And I chose Jeff Buckley's Grace. And he said this thing to me, he said like, hey man, have you heard Jeff Buckley? Or there's some phrase that he used, or Jeff Buckley died at the foot of Beale Street, something that I felt, and even just him saying it, there was some rhythm to it. And I thought like, that's just this conversational thing that this writer has just said to me, but there's something to it that feels like a song is there. Mm-hmm. And I was really taken by the story, and I was taken by his album. So I was inspired on all these different levels, but whatever he ended up saying, it didn't end up in the song, but it was sort of the seed of that song. I think what he said was, hey man, have you heard Jeff Buckley died in Memphis, Tennessee? When they found his body, he was floating in the water at the foot of Beale Street. And it was something like that. And I kind of, that just had this nice rhythm, sort of musical quality to it. Yeah. And so I ended up writing this longer poem and then putting music to the longer poem.
Yeah. I want to get back to the pen question only because I could do an entire website dedicated to the importance of the type of color of ink and the type of pen and even paper songwriters use. Like they're very loyal to certain, it'd only be a certain type of brand or a certain color of ink. Sure. Does that matter to you at all?
You know, I think when it comes like my preferred, I'm of two brains of this. I do have like a nice, super like sort of, Japanese large sort of sketchbook with like nice heavy weighted white paper, and using like a nice pen on that's black ink feels really good. But I think actually sort of my preferred way of writing is having just a classic Bic pen, black Bic pen with the yellow notepads, just the big yellow notepads. And I think why I like that is because there's low pressure there to be messy. There's something with the large sort of expensive Japanese sort of very fashionable notebook where you feel like you only want to put in final drafts to it, you know, and like it's just like the paper and the design and the layout feel like, oh, this is only for something really good or something that feels really complete or finished. Whereas with the, $2 CVS notepad and the pack of big pens, it feels like a free for all and you can be as messy as you want. So those are kind of my preferred when I'm going that route. I really enjoy them.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The answers to that. It's fascinating, the type of pens. But so to me, that's part of a ritual. So I know you said you're not a rules type of guy, but I guess, is there, like for me, okay, so for example, like I never write and revise in the same room. I never write and revise in the same chair. It could be two chairs in the same room, but for me, I need to get far away from my writing process when I revise. So I try to get as far away from that as I can. So that's part of my ritual. I know it works for me. So is there like a time of day or a place where you think, oh, I'm more successful than other places, or does that not matter to you at all?
It does, the place could really be anywhere, but I think the big thing for me is being alone. I think just carving out some sort of space. I'm lucky right now where I have a house that is sort of a dedicated studio. I have two homes in Kansas City, and one of them is just like a music house. And I tend to pace a lot when I'm writing, especially if I'm playing guitar at the same time. So I really pacing back and forth across the living room is the sort of heaven to me. That's bliss to me. But that's been pacing back and forth in a hotel room or a green room or, in a friend's guest room, or it could be so many different places. But I think just carving out a little quiet place for myself, and there could even be something going on in the other room, but just having my own, four walls where I feel like I'm kind of in the safety to explore this thing. With that said, a lot of times if I get an initial idea in one place, kind of like what you're saying, I do like to sort of go explore that idea elsewhere, usually in transit, whether, like I said, being on an airplane or being on some sort of road trip, or even just taking it to another city with the goal, or I'm losing the word here, but with the intention of writing, taking some sort of writing trip. I'm going, okay, I've written this song in Kansas. Now I'm going to take it to New York and see how it feels in New York. And, does that make sense?
It does. But what does that, I guess that I've never heard that before. So what changes in that song when you go to the other city? That's interesting.
I think it's just maybe some other perspective, some different angle. And it doesn't necessarily have to even be about the song's subject matter or anything. It can just be, I don't know. I would say actually it's less about the city, and I feel like I'm kind of working this out in real time on this, but I honestly feel like it's just about getting into another room, and so it's not about like, this sounded like this in Kansas. How does this sound in New York? It's more about like, this sounded like this in my living room in Kansas. Now I'm in a hotel room far away from home, and I'm in in another form of sort of seclusion. How does it feel here?
Does time of day matter? Can you prefer late night, early morning, or does that not matter at all?
Well, it's funny you bring up both of those, because I I've often cited both of those as the best sort of times when you're sort of half awake, half asleep in the early morning or late at night before going to sleep. Having a guitar next to the bed, in both of those situations, I have one just hanging off my wall to kind of take down, because I feel like in the light of day, which I've certainly gotten a lot of good work done in the light of day, but in those sort of moments, those twilight moments on either side of the day, I find that your guard is sort of down. If you come up with a silly idea or a stupid idea, you're not really judging yourself where, if it's 3 p.m. and you're quote unquote working on writing a song and you come up with a stupid idea, you might dismiss it. But in those hours, you kind of might see something, something cool about the silly idea, or just see it from the perspective of, I don't know, just your creative doors are open a little bit more at that hour, and your sort of your critic walls are down a little bit. And so I really like those times of the day. But with that said, I do, any hour of the day really can work.
So I bring this up a lot because, and you mentioned this with the period before sleep. So I've been mentioning this a lot to songwriters. So there was a study I read about a year ago it was in Smithsonian Magazine, but it was a study they cited about that period right before you fall asleep. And it's not, it's not when you're asleep. It's that hazy moment when you're not awake, you're not asleep. There's a name for it. I always forget what it is, but there's a name. Anyway, in the study, they cite the story about Salvador Dali, and this is what he would do. He would sit, and there's a picture of him in the magazine. And he's sitting in this horribly uncomfortable, like wicker chair, and he's got a skeleton key in his hand, and he's sitting in the chair, and he's got his arm extended, and he's got on the floor underneath the key, he's got a saucer. And so right when he falls asleep, obviously he lets go of the key. It falls on the saucer. It wakes him up. He starts to paint.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so apparently, and they actually replicated this somehow with people and found that that's a fruitful time. So is that what you're talking about? Kind of that hazy, I'm curious if that's ever happened to you, I guess, in that period, not in the middle of the night, but when you're just kind of drifting and all of a sudden, words or ideas come to you.
Absolutely. It's funny you asked that question now, because only a few days ago, something sort of came to me. And what I'm describing is a little bit more lucid than that. You're a little bit more, it's like you're getting ready to go to sleep or you're getting ready to get up. And it's kind of just using those sort of quiet moments to write. You're a little out of it, but you're not, you're not fully to subconscious yet. And with that said, there have been so many moments in my life where I'm getting ready to fall asleep, and you're basically in a dream state. And I like to almost describe it as like words come to you. It feels like they're on some sort of like river, like a phrase will make itself your way, and you find it. And there are times where I'm strong enough to get myself out of bed and write that down or document it in some way. There's a lot of times where I think, oh, that's so good, I'll just remember that. And then of course it's gone by the morning. That happened to me a few days ago, and I'm still kicking myself. And the funny thing with those moments is you really don't know. I've had so many of those moments where I wake up the next day and I've jotted this thing down or sang this melody into my phone. And I am like, oh, wow, I'm so glad I captured that. That's really something. And there's a ton of times where I'm like, oh my God, like, what was I thinking? Like, this is not cool at all. But just in that like half asleep dream world, it just seems profound for whatever reason that's unexplainable now. In the light of day. But I do think that there's something to that. I think that songwriting, so much of it is about sort of letting the creative spirit know, like, I'm here and I'm ready to do it whenever you are. Find me whenever you want to. And I think sometimes that the creative spirit can be a little mischievous and find you at a time where, maybe you're a little off guard to see how serious you really are about it. So I think whenever it does come, like Dali is portraying in this act of whatever, setting up his own little alarm system to paint. I think, it's good to follow that, even if sometimes it seems a little silly the next day, because it can really lead to something amazing.
All right. So you mentioned pacing, and I was going to ask this question anyway, but I'm a big Erin Ray fan. I interviewed her about a month. Yeah. I interviewed her. She's on the podcast about a month ago. She said the exact same thing, that she paces. and there's certain type of floors. I think she said a hardwood floor. I can't remember what she said, but she uses pacing. And so it's funny that you have a song on the album with her,
That's
but
funny.
you're the only two people that have ever said that.
That's funny. I like that.
Yeah, I mean, she said specifically that she has to pace, and she paces around, and she says it's sometimes difficult because she's with her guitar and she's got to hold a pen, and then the ideas come to her, and then she stops. So I'm just curious as to, I love that song on the album with her.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry if you've mentioned this before, but what was I'm curious about how you two, the specific process with that song.
Well, number one, I love that she said that. That's amazing. Because pacing on a hardwood floor specifically is the best. There's something to it. I don't know. It's almost just this nervous energy of, it's almost like, if your crush called you or something and you're like pacing back and forth, like the phone's going to ring. That's kind of how it feels when you start to write a song sometimes. Like, oh my God, it's here. Like, I can't lose this thing. Like, I got to be alert. I got to be on my toes. But for Aaron, in terms of Bittersweet Tennessee, our song together on my record, I've written that song. It's obviously about Tennessee, and Tennessee is sort of a metaphor within the song, but obviously, I'm singing the name of a state, and I wanted someone who was native to that state to sing on it. And so I was thinking of who that could be, and Aaron was the first person to come to mind. And, had she not even been from Tennessee, I think it's very likely would have done the collaboration anyways. She's just one of my favorite songwriters and just an incredible singer. And just beyond all of that, one of my favorite people just to be around. She's amazing hang. And so I'm really, really proud and happy about how that song turned out. And when I've done duets before, I've done a lot of duets with my girlfriend who plays under the moniker Waxahachie.
Right.
I've sang with Kate LeBon. I feel like it's always this, it's like half I just want to hang out with the person because they're so awesome, and then half they just really make sense for the song.
All right, couple more questions. One, I think you mentioned running, and I'm a big runner, and I've written about this in the Washington Post.
Amazing.
Actually, there's a very clear link between aerobic activity and higher order thinking, creativity as well. And and this has been replicated in many studies, but what they've done is put people on a treadmill for 20 minutes. 30 is ideal at 60% max heart rate, which is like no more than like a moderate walk. So it's not that much. And then after the treadmill, giving them a battery of tests. And those people always score higher than people that didn't exercise. So there's a chemical called brain-derived neurotrophic factor that's secreted in the brain with with increased blood flow, which is exercise. So about 90 minutes post-exercise, you're at your sweet spot. So I use running absolutely as a part of my process. So I'd love to talk about that, how much of a part of that is, because this has been, and a lot of songwriters, again, use exercise. Since you mentioned, I'm curious as to how much of that, how often you get ideas, and how is that a part of your process?
Sure. Yeah. That's amazing that you wrote that, and that you run and you find creativity in that. I think it's so amazing. I read Murakami's book. This is what we talk about when we talk about running, and his whole process on writing and running. And I think he explains it so well, and to sort of, paraphrase what he explains in that book, just it's very much a yin yang. You have one, he basically just talks about how, I was a writer and suddenly my life became about sitting still and being inside. So I did this other thing to counter it. And what he found in doing that is that both complemented one another. And that's certainly, reading that book, it was just felt like he was putting all of my thoughts down on paper, because that's exactly how I feel in doing something that's sort of stagnant. Writing is, you're alone in this room. There's something for me in taking these ideas that I create in a room with a closed door out into the world, and I can listen to the demos while I run. I can mull over the lyrics in my mind. That's something that I've done a lot, where it's just, I'll have this phrase and I'm just repeating it to myself. I won't even run with headphones, and I'll just be repeating this phrase to myself, trying to work out a kink within the lyrics. And kind of what I mentioned about the flight earlier and listening to stuff on the flight, it's similar, but a more profound version of that, where there's like this no bullshit factor that happens when I'm running, and I don't know what it is or how it does it, but I'm suddenly able to so clearly see what's good and what's bad. this also works for other decisions in my life that are beyond creative decisions. If I'm in a fight with a friend, or if I am having trouble with something, pertaining to my work or whatever, and I don't know the answer for it, usually a run kind of provides the clear, like, well, all you need to do is this. It's really easy. Just do this. And so I found myself in my life, if I ever have a big decision or a big conversation I want to have with someone or whatever, I'm like, I'm going to go on a run before I do this. And it always, every single time, it clears out the fog, and it shows me sort of like the correct way to go about it. And this really works for creativity. Sometimes I've described to people, sometimes running for me is, it's almost like getting drunk. Like, there's moments where I'm so euphoric within a run where I'm like, I'm going to call up this old friend and tell him I love him, and then after the run, I'm like, what was I thinking? Like, I'm not going to, that's okay. I'll just, if I bump into them, I'll just tell them I missed them or something. But with writing, it's really an amazing tool. And I think if nothing else, even if you're not having some profound moment on the run, or it's making you see something clear, nothing else, it's getting you away from your writing so you can go back to your writing, if that makes sense. And I think as a songwriter, especially someone who tours and then gets off the road and has nothing to do, seemingly having this sort of structure of like, I'm going to run, it is so beneficial, not only to all of my life, but especially to songwriting.
I use it. I mean, I was nodding my head vigorously when you said that, because I'm the exact same way. When I get in a rut as a writer, that's when I go for a run, because I have this confidence it's going to shake itself out on the run. So have you ever gotten song ideas? Because some songwriters tell me the cadence of the run.
Sure.
I've heard things like walking, hiking. Has that ever happened to you where the cadence of a run actually gets you in the groove of something?
Absolutely. Yeah. And sort of the rhythm and just like the way, the ground feels beneath your feet. Absolutely. And it sounds so silly, but it's even, there's moments where I've been struggling with the song or whatever. And then you think, well, I'm going to push through this run just as I'm going to push through this song. And I think that the sort of most hard copy example I have of this is, while I was writing, this is a photograph. There was a period where I was living out of the Peabody Hotel in downtown Memphis. And it was during 2020, it was COVID, and I was alone, but I was running every other day. So every other day I would go run along the Mississippi River. And just that sort of act of that river is so influential to the record and to that city and to so many people who came before me and their lives surrounding music in that city, and sort of just being out in the elements of that. This is a unique example in that it wasn't about shaking something out, or it wasn't about something becoming clear, but just sort of existing, like having an excuse or a way to sort of connect with this body of water and connect with this city in that certain way. I think what I like about running is it sort of gives you the keys to the universe. And suddenly, if I was just walking along a river early in the morning, that might kind of seem a little strange, or it's probably just something I wouldn't do or get much out of. But if I'm running, suddenly it makes a lot of sense. So it's almost like I was doing research on my songs, and running was the vehicle and how I was able to sort of be out in the elements amongst these things, if that makes sense.
It does. And I was going to say also that when they've done this with people outside, they found that urban environments completely negate the effect, because if you're running in a city, your brain has to focus on not being run over by cars.
Survival, sure.
So the most effective place is the nature, is probably a river or the woods or something. And so there's so many factors. It's fascinating stuff.
It's really amazing. I was running a lot while recording as well in upstate New York. I was finding different paths. And again, with recording, the songs have already been written at that point, but you get stuck on one thing, or you're trying to write a part on top of the song or whatever it is. And just that run always shakes it out. And if nothing else, you can just come back to it clear and not frustrated. And running is just saved my life, really.
Yeah. And you're in better shape. Okay. So quick follow-up to that. What about, because I see the laundry machine, the washer and dryer behind you. So I found I mentioned that because a lot of songwriters tell me they get song ideas doing mundane activities in the house.
Yeah,
like
big time.
Vacuuming. One of them told me, Keb Mo told me, folding clothes. He loves to fold clothes and write, and song ideas come to him. So cooking, ironing, cleaning, those mundane activities So does that happen to you when you're doing those mundane activities in the house when you get those song ideas?
Absolutely. I think it's all these are just different versions of singing in the shower of,
Yeah.
Just how, especially again, I think as someone that's cool that Kevmo said that, who, by the way, I feel this sort of, I feel this connection to him because often on people's cars, it mistakes him for me. We obviously look nothing alike, but because he's Kevmo and I'm Kevin Morby, so I really want to meet Kevmo someday so we can have this. People are very confused. Why is everyone seeing your photo and stuff?
I can't believe I just made that connection.
Yeah, it was just really funny. But I totally agree with what he's saying. I think, especially for touring musicians, I think we all can really agree, especially when you come home from something and you have no routine, having little things to do is kind of when the wheels will start turning. It's funny because I've been making my living off of music now for over 10 years, but beforehand I used to deliver food for a living and I worked at a cafe, and doing those things and sort of doing the monotonous, busy work was always when I would be writing songs. Again, that was kind of my life's at that moment's version of sitting on an airplane or going on a run maybe. But it was, rolling silverware for the next day for the diner, or, just loading up the coffee machines for the next day, mopping the floor. It's always those moments when the ideas can come to you where you're doing something, but the thing that you're doing is sort of autopilot and your brain can kind of be working in a whole other realm.
How much reading do you get to do? And who do you like to read? Favorite authors, things like that?
My goal every year is to read 12 books a year, which is a book a month. I usually do a pretty good job. I'll let it overflow too. If I read a lot one year, I'll say, I need to read 8 books next year or whatever. But I try to read as much as possible. I read a lot on the road. I can really read well on the road. Whereas when I'm back and I'm not in transit, it's a little more difficult. I'm probably just more distracted by things happening at home. Whereas with all the downtime on the road, I get a lot of reading done. But I love reading, and I find, it's the same sort of animal as songwriting, but also very different. It's two sides of the same coin, I suppose. But I really admire and envy authors and what they're able to do. It's such an amazing skill, and reading is endlessly inspiring to me, and it's made its way into so many of my songs. I feel like a lot of my stuff is there's a lot of literary references. Someone I was reading a lot at the time of making Is a Photograph is maybe my most favorite contemporary author, Rachel Kushner. Yeah. If you ever heard of her, she's amazing. I'm reading a Jennifer Egan book right now. That's really
Which
good.
one? The new one?
The new one, Candy House. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't read that. I've read what is it? Visit from the Goon Squad. Is that what it was called?
From the Goon Squad. And this is like 10 years later, sort of picking up on those same characters, which is good. So
you did read it? I
read Goon Squad. Yeah. Love it.
The Jennifer Egan, the new one. Have you read the new one?
I'm like halfway through Candy House.
Okay.
So I'm reading that. Yeah, it's great. And I just read a book earlier this year that I really loved. And I actually forget the author's name, but it's called Widow Basquiat. And it's a memoir it's a memoir from the voice of Basquiat's longtime girlfriend, but written by another woman. And it's a really amazing book. I really recommend it. So, I'm always trying to read new stuff. I love, the classics, and I love the classic authors. I love Flannery O'Connor or James Baldwin or Larry McMurtry. The list goes on. But I'm always trying to have a book in my hand.
So how do you pick who to read? Do you have, because for me, I'll tell you what I do. I just go to book review websites and kind of, bestseller lists are iffy, but book review websites, it's like, oh, is this a plot I'd like to read? So do you get recommendations from friends, or how do you pick what to read?
I feel that's a great question. I feel like it's the same way that I consume really any other type of art or movies or bands, because I feel like there's a lot of times where if I seek stuff out, it doesn't, sometimes it'll jump out to me and I'll really love it. But I find when it naturally finds me, whether a friend is like, oh, you have to read this. Or if I end up, like the Rachel Kushner, I got into her because, I read an article that she had done in the New Yorker or they published one of her essays, and I love the essay so much. And then I went on to read 3 or 4 of her books. And so it's always kind of something hits me at the right time, the right circumstance, or a friend makes the right recommendation. I do look at book lists for sure, and I'll see what people are saying on Goodreads and whatever. And it's also like with directors, if I find a book that I like or something comes my way, and then I'll try to read, numerous books by that author, and I'll just kind of exist in their little world for a while.
And that's it for the latest episode of Songwriters on Process. Don't forget, you can find all of my interviews with over 200 songwriters on my Songwriters on Process website at songwritersonprocess.com, going all the way back to 2010. You can read them, watch them, or listen to them. So until next time, thanks for listening.